Welcome everyone. Today in Giraffe, we're going to be taking a look at some drawing methods, tips and tricks on how you can best utilize the buildings feature, the landscape feature, and the land uses. So I've done a little bit of setting up for this project, but what we're basically going to work towards is creating something similar to if I turn on these layers. I've got a building footprint that's defined here, and that's just aligned to some planning controls that I introduced. And then I've created a little bit of a demo build here. So this is something that we're going to be working towards, and the methods of which we can start to generate this geometry in Giraffe to start to define our project. Let's jump in and start to recreate this form and talk through some of the strategies involved behind this. So let me just turn off the demo build. We'll leave the parcel or the building footprint there. I might just adjust the opacity on that one, and we will save those layer changes. All right, so now that we've got our lot defined, we've got a building footprint, and we can start creating some geometry. And so I want to make sure that I've selected the drawing methods drawing layer. So that's my active drawing layer, and any geometry I create is now hosted on that layer. I'm also going to toggle into 2D mode, and now I can navigate up to the drawing toolbar at the top and select buildings. So the buildings, what we see here, so common typologies or usages is what we call them in Giraffe within the industry, and what we see most frequently used. So if you scan your eyes down the list, you can see some retail, a warehouse, residential, and some other usages down here. And the idea here is that there's a base set of assumptions behind each of these usages. I'm not going to dive into that today. We do have other videos that I'll link in the description. However, what we're going to focus on today is the methods in which we can create this geometry. So I'm going to try to recreate that mixed use development that I showed earlier. And the first step I want to take is just to add a retail ground floor component. So I'm just selected retail, and then it's pushed me into this drawing mode. I've got the little black dot over my cursor, and I can now start to draw my rectangle on my site. So I just drew a rectangle, and now I can sort of add a segment in that line and start to push that back so we get that L shape, that what I was hoping for in that earlier design. So that's one way that we can create that form. And as I mentioned, this is talking through a number of methods. So it's up to you which you prefer and which might be more suitable to your project. But let's just delete that one for now. And I'm going to navigate back up to the Draw Buildings tab. And instead of selecting on retail, you'll notice that there's two symbols to the right. And this is the polygon method or the irregular method. And we've got a spine method in creating that geometry. So if I select the polygon method, and maybe this is my origin point here, I'm just going to hold Shift to snap directly up the page 180 degrees. And then I'm going to hold Shift again to snap, make sure that's a 90-degree right angle, and start to create my form. So maybe it's around the sort of 14 meters or so, and holding Shift to snap as well to that 90-degree plane, and then double click to finish that form. So we can see again, we created quite quickly that L-shaped geometry, and we can jump in and sort of edit that as we need. The last method that I want to talk through is the spine creation method. So if I navigate back up to buildings here, select the spine method, and what I'm going to do is just define two lines. So I'm going to draw, holding Shift again, just to snap that into the vertical plane, and then holding Shift again and double click to finish that line. So you can see here quite quickly we did recreate that same geometry, and we've got some added properties when we use the spine method, and they're on the left hand side. So there's some geometry settings here. We've got the offset distance, the offset direction, so you can flip that to the other side. However, this is suitable for our site. I'm just going to navigate back to the rectangle method. So I'm going to delete this one, jump back into building, select retail, and draw my site out, add a segment, and then pull that back. So I am happy with that. And if I navigate back into 3D mode, you will notice that each of these usages in here come with their own preset assumptions baked into it. And so the idea here is that we can start to draw basic geometry, but has some complex data driving that behind the scenes. So again, I'll link that video in the description to the usage editor and how you can customize to suit your workflow. But we're going to be focusing on the drawing methods today. So that's great. I've created my ground floor retail component, and now I want to just add a residential stack on top of that. So the best way we can do that is by simply Control-C, Control-V. We're just going to copy and paste that on top of each other. And the key thing to remember here is that when we do that copy and paste, they have to be on the same layer. Otherwise, they will not stack. So an important point to remember there when you are trying to stack geometry. So I've stacked that on top now, and I want to actually adjust that to a residential usage. So again, the usage comes with different set of parameters and assumptions attached to it. So I'm going to navigate across here to usage and just type in residential. And great, I've got my residential usage. However, it's on the bottom. So this is where the stack order property comes into play. So you might have already noticed that on the left-hand side in the properties panel, we have a property that's called stack order. And that's very simply positions it within the stack of geometry that you have on the screen. So it knows where it is supposed to sit. So if I adjust that to 2, and it now knows that it has to be above my retail geometry, which if I select that, has a stack order property of 1. So now I can jump back into the residential and we can add some levels there. So maybe it's, let's add just 2 levels because maybe we want to step that form a little bit as well as we go up higher into the 6 levels. All right, so I do want to also add that when we start creating this geometry, they are independent of each other. So any editing that we do to the residential won't carry through to the retail on the ground floor. So a lot of planning controls sometimes dictate that there's a step back once you get over certain levels. So maybe we've got the ground floor has certain setbacks, but from level 1 upwards, there is additional setbacks required. And so what I'm going to do is actually navigate into 2D mode. And let's say there's an additional 1 meter setback to Boyce Street and Mansfield Street. And if I just drag that, type 1 on my keyboard, again, typing 1 to define that 1 meter, and then navigating back with T on my keyboard into 3D. And now I can see that step back has been applied to the residential usage. And this may be for privacy or overshadowing concerns. So the next thing I want to do is I actually want to stack this geometry a third time. Control-C, Control-V, again, stacking that on top of each other. And again, this becomes independent. So what I can do is actually start to drag this and we start to introduce some character into our design. And maybe this level here actually has a step as well. And now it's becoming much similar to our original demo build that what we were aiming to achieve in this demonstration. So the next thing I want to add is a landscape component or landscape usage here to the courtyard. And the way I can do that is first, if I toggle into 2D mode, just a more controlled way of drawing, is navigating up to the landscape tab. So up the top here, again, we see those same creation methods that we saw in the buildings tab. So you've got your polygon tool and your spline method with each of these usages that you can create. I'm going to select the simple usage here, the simple landscape usage, and I'm just going to select directly on it to use the rectangle creation method. So holding shift to snap that up the page and then defining the width. So what I can do here is actually hold S on my keyboard and snap it to the end of my retail usage. So I'm happy with that. Maybe I need to pull it off a little bit from the building facade there. And now I've got my landscape component. There's a number of other features in here, and I do want to add one more, which is a parking element. So this is a question that we get a lot. And how do we add underground parking? So there's an option here, underground parking, and I want my parking to basically capture the building footprint, as there's potentially a deep soil component to that landscaped area. So with my parking, I'm going to actually select the polygon method. And if I select that, pushes me into this draw state. And now what I want to do is just trace around my building footprint. So if I hold S on my keyboard, it will allow me to snap to those corners. And I'm just snapping to each corner and then double click to complete that geometry. And now what it's done, if I toggle into 2D mode, is actually create a basement car park of 2 levels deep, which we can see over in the properties panel. And if I undo that, if I select the retail usage and drag that back in a little bit, we can see that parking usage being applied. Although we can't see below the ground plane, we have the property listed on the left-hand side, so we can adjust the levels there if needed to our underground parking. And I'll just drag this back over the parking and hold S to snap. And so now we've defined our parking. We've added a retail ground floor aspect with residential above, and we have a landscaped courtyard area. And the last thing I want to mention is the land use tool. So navigating back up to the drawing toolbar, selecting land use, again, that same creation method that we've seen exhibited across building and landscape. We can also do that in land use. So a land use is, again, a type of usage. However, these usages represent more generalized planning uses rather than the built form, which is what we used previously to create our project. So if I navigate down to, let's say, a low density residential and navigate into 2D mode, and let's say that this area adjacent to our site was maybe a low density residential zone, being fairly sort of rough with that definition, toggling back into 2D mode, and we can see how a land use differs to a building use. So we've got the planning use on the left-hand side and the building types on the right. So we can see the building usages have some levels defined, whereas the land use just has a height defined for its property. And the idea here is that depending on what stage you are within the project pipeline is whether you would use one or the other. So I won't dive into that too deeply in today's session. However, it's good to understand that the land uses are used early on in the project where we don't really understand site-specific planning controls, and so we make large assumptions across, say, the greenfield site. Whereas the building sections on the right-hand side, we do know a little bit about the site. We know its boundary, maybe we know some setbacks and things like that, and so we can really start to define that shape using the building sections. However, it is important to note that both methods allow us to pull that rich data through into the analytics side of things and process that. I think there's a lot of content there, so all the best, and we'll see you in the next video.